It's going to be very interesting to moderate this session, and I would also like to tell you that we are filming this and it's streamed externally. So please try to keep your questions short and concise and speak into the microphone. It's very nice to be here today. I would like to start to introduce Karin Bäckstrand. She is professor in Environmental Social Science, Department of Political Science at the Stockholm University. And it's very nice to have you here. We're going to hear more about her experience later. And Kevin Noone, professor of meteorology, applied environmental science at Stockholm University. And he was also previously the executive director of the International Biosphere Program, IDP. And I'm going to introduce my colleague, Richard Klein, Stockholm Environment Institute. And he has 20 years of experience. And Richard is a leading expert in the science and policy of adaptation climate change. And he contributed as lead author to 6 reports from the IPCC. And youngest first listed author, so he's now inspiring his 2 sons to continue with their work. Please feel welcome, Richard, and start to give us an introduction about what are the main conclusions from the IPCC researchers who has been participating.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ilva, and good afternoon. The title of this session is Climate Change is Happening, So What Now? But we thought before we go into the so what now question, it might make sense to very briefly capture what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change concluded after 6 years of doing their 5th assessment report. There are 3 working groups. They all have a summary. Those have been synthesized, and that one also has a summary, and that one had a number of headline statements, and I'm going to present those. So I'm going to present a summary of a synthesis of the IPCC 5th assessment report, which in total is about 5,000 pages. And I think if I click this one, yes, indeed. The first headline message, I don't have a screen here in front of me, okay. Human influence on the climate system is clear, and recent anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases are the highest in history. That's a statement of fact. It's based on a lot of research, and there are different lines of evidence that make this statement valid. Recent climate changes have had widespread impacts on human and natural systems. So we know that climate change is happening, we know it's human-induced, and we know it's already showing its effects on nature and society. This is a graph that you might have seen before that shows the annual average temperature worldwide from the mid-19th century until now. You can see that there is a gradual increase, particularly from the beginning of the 20th century onwards. And the projections are that depending on the emissions of greenhouse gases in the future, that this increase in temperature will continue. Impacts are already observed. Climate change is not only something that happens in the future, it is already happening now, and we can see impacts on all continents, in rich countries and in poor countries, as well as in the oceans. These are some pictures of the typical sort of media splashes that whenever you see a climate disaster. We do know that several climate extremes can already be attributed to climate change and to human activity, particularly since 1950. Not all extremes, I should add, but particularly heat waves and droughts can be attributed to climate change. The second headline message, so it's where we start moving towards from the observations to what we can expect and what we can do about it. Continued emissions of greenhouse gases will cause further warming and long-lasting changes in all components of the climate system, increasing the likelihood of severe, pervasive, and irreversible impacts for people and ecosystems. So that's a fairly stark warning, but again based very much on the scientific literature of the past decades. Limiting climate change would require substantial and sustained reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, which together with adaptation, preparing and dealing with the impact of climate change, can limit the risk of climate change. This shows the sources of greenhouse gas emissions. You can see that the energy sector, because of the fossil fuel use, is the predominant one, but agriculture, forest, and other land use is a very strong second, and that's particularly strong in developing countries. Then industry, transport, and the building sector, particularly cement, are also strong contributors. This shows you what we might expect in the future. On the left, there are two lines. One, if you like, optimistic and one pessimistic scenario. The bottom one, the blue one, shows what we might achieve if all countries get their act together and try and reduce emissions very quickly and very rigorously. The red line, the top one, shows what might happen if that doesn't occur, sort of a business as usual scenario. The outcome of that are two quite different worlds. The optimistic scenario shows an average temperature increase of roughly 1.5, with some uncertainty around it, by the end of the century, and the pessimistic one of almost 5 degrees, with some uncertainty around it. Now, that then is linked to the diagram on the right that shows the risks of a number of systems as a function of temperature increase. Unique and threatened systems like coral reefs, extreme weather events, heat waves, floods, droughts, distribution of impacts between north and south, global aggregate impacts, economically speaking, and large-scale singular events. And as you can see from the color, as it gets warmer, as the global temperature by the end of the century is higher, the risk of those also increase. And based on that knowledge already a few years ago, politicians decided that an increase of no more than 2 degrees compared to pre-industrial temperatures would be sort of an upper limit to strive for in the climate negotiations that have just started in Lima, for example. That doesn't mean that there is no risk at all, but it is seen as at least preventing climate change that is dangerous. There are two ways of addressing climate change: reducing the greenhouse gas emissions, of course, but also preparing for the impacts, adaptation and mitigation. They're complementary strategies for reducing climate risk. And they work hand in hand. Substantial emissions reductions over the next few decades can reduce climate risk in the 21st century, increase prospects for effective adaptation, and reduce the cost and challenge of mitigation in the long term. What it says here is that early action would be beneficial in many ways. There are several reasons for that, which I highlighted here. Measures exist to achieve the substantial emissions, so it's not a question of finding new technologies to reduce emissions. Many studies have shown that technologies and other measures already exist to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and stay below 2 degrees. And the bottom one, I think, is a key message for the discussion here. Delaying mitigation will substantially increase the challenges associated with the 2-degree target. And this is what the world might look like in the optimistic scenario and in the pessimistic scenario. The 1.5 and 4.5 degrees that I showed in the graph are global averages. You can see that on land the warming will be more, and particularly at the higher latitudes. You can see that Sweden is pretty dark red over there in the pessimistic scenario. The last headline message: many adaptation and mitigation options can help address climate change, but no single option is sufficient by itself. We can all change our behavior, but it won't do much good if, for example, land use change is not addressed at the same time. We can all do something in Sweden, but it won't do any good if no action is taken in China, for example. Effective implementation depends on policies and cooperation at all scales, from the local to the global, and can be enhanced through integrated responses that link adaptation and mitigation with other societal objectives. And that's exactly what the discussion is about in Lima and next year in Paris under the UNFCCC, and I think that's also the conversation that we should be having here. How do we move from knowing that climate change is a problem to actually trying to not only understand the solutions, but help implement them? And that as an introduction to the conversation we'll have here. We're not talking about whether or not climate change is happening or what the uncertainties are or how to reduce further uncertainties. really take as a starting point the findings of the IPCC, not only about the science of climate change, but also about the knowledge on adaptation and mitigation and what would be needed to stay within a safe climate. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Very enlightening, I think. And if there are questions from the floor already now on Richard's presentation, I would like to take them. We've got questions? No? Okay. As Richard said, the negotiations are taking place in Lima, and we have 12 researchers in place, and it's going to be a very interesting negotiation period the coming 2 weeks, so we're hoping for the best. I would like to Karin Bäckstrand to enter the floor. And she's going to speak a little bit about the political side of things and the negotiations.
Okay. Yes, just to say my background, I'm a political scientist, so excellent introduction to IPCC here. So for us as political scientists, and my specialty is global environmental politics, an extremely important question is, of course, the prospect for a climate deal in 2015. And what is at state of play now in Lima that Richard referred to? So we are now in a regulatory vacuum in that sense that we lack long-term binding targets to decrease emissions. And so 2014 and 15, as Richard indicated, is a critical year to advance these negotiations and get a text that can serve as a foundation for a successor agreement to Kyoto. So we basically need a solid draft of 2020 commitment in line with IPCC recommendations with 2-degree targets. And in a way, for the developing countries, we will discuss this, this is the last chance for them to push, industrialize the rich world to commit to more action in Lima 2015 to 20. So I've been just thinking a little bit, what is the best and worst case for Paris 2015? And in a way, these climate negotiations that have been going on for 22 years, they are actually very much a negotiation of what form an agreement should take. Should it take legally binding, top-down negotiated target and timetables, the Kyoto style, which EU advocates, or should there be a more flexible treaty where countries pledge and submit voluntary emissions? And this, of course, US and Australia and the umbrella group forwards. And we know now after Copenhagen 2009, the new world after Copenhagen, as many say, a geopolitical shaking of the world. To quote our Minister of Environment, the disaster in Copenhagen. But many saw it as new opening. We landed in having a more flexible, voluntary approach to this. So what to expect then in outcome in Paris? Actually, there are 3 scenarios. 2 I don't think are very realistic, but I will outline them. So the shadow of Copenhagen may still rest over Paris, that it shouldn't be a failure. So one scenario is the Kyoto 2 legally binding agreements with timetable, which you all know here in the room is very unrealistic, but just to state it. The second scenario that would really be a disaster is a collapse in the negotiations, such as in Hague 2001, and a continued regulatory vacuum. Then there, of course, could be a kind of something in between. Copenhagen was near a collapse, but the most likely scenario that most seasoned negotiators and commentators would agree upon would be this bottom-up soft framework agreement for these nationally determined contributions to be signed in Paris 2015 and then coming into force and strengthened. So this would, I would say, be the best case scenario. And there are some very positive signs of this that we will discussing. The US Climate Pact is one, and actually the climate summit in New York in 23rd of September actually also gathered momentum. So there are some very promising, maybe I'm too optimistic now, signs. Just to conclude on a final thought, it's very easy, as also a political scientist, to be very pessimistic. We know that the commitments on the table so far are so insufficient for the 2-degree or 1.5-degree world that Richard outlined. So we cannot expect a breakthrough deal in Paris. But I think sometimes, and I say that to my students, we should ask the counterfactual question: where would the world be today if we didn't have 22 years of diplomacy, building up the institution on the United Nations Framework for Climate Change, the Kyoto Protocol, the whole climate regime? It is a framework that states agreed upon, and from that we could gradually get more climate action. So I think one can see maybe the glass as half full rather than half empty. So I try to end at that optimistic note.
Okay, thank you very much. And I would like to invite Kevin Noone to speak a little bit about what some examples that we see from business. If you want to do that, well, also Richard can come on.
Come on up, Richard. Right, so thanks, Ylva. We've been talking a lot of, and the focus now obviously is on the international political arena, the negotiations in Lima, the negotiations next year in Paris. But it's not just countries that will have to be involved in coming to some sort of solution for climate-related issues and other issues as well. NGOs, in particular the private sector, have a very large role to play. And in some ways, I see action happening in that arena and at a rate and to a level that really isn't yet present in the international negotiations. Just as a couple of examples, we have major oil companies like Shell and BP saying, look, we would like a price on carbon. And that doesn't seem to alarm them as much as it alarms many of the international, national level politicians. Many companies having the opportunity to consult with both of those, but also with a company called DNVGL, it used to be Dinovsky Veritas, looking at sustainability issues. How, if I am running a company that's been around for 100 to 150 years, and I want that company to be around for another century, I have to look at least that far in advance. And doing that, I need to be concerned about stability. I need to be concerned about predictability of societies, not just climate, but in many other regimes as well. So I think, from what I can see anyway, there's a realization in the private sector, a willingness in the private sector to think much longer term than in many political arenas, and the ability to make action happen. That is much a larger challenge for the international nation-state arena like the United Nations is. So I think we certainly can't not have the United Nations regime. That's absolutely necessary. But I think there is action happening, and that sort of action should be stimulated, it should be encouraged, it should be supported within the private sector as well.
I come up with a quite interesting question. What do you think the reasons for the oil and gas industry is to engage in combating climate change? Is it money, or is it to become more popular as a company?
Well, if I could answer that, I'd probably be running one of them. But from the interaction that I've had with many of these companies, again, a lot of them have been around for a long time, and they would like to be around for a long time in the future. And what they're seeing is the current disconnection between what the science is saying about climate change and the political decision-making about climate change in terms of carbon taxes, feed-in tariffs, whatever. that discrepancy is not good for their business. And long term, if that discrepancy continues, it means it makes their business much more difficult to run. That's even beyond the instability that will be caused by climate change in terms of people being able to and wanting to buy their product in the future. So there's economic interest at the base of all this, but it's more rational thinking and long-term thinking.
It's also to do with predictability,
Yeah,
isn't it?
exactly.
I mean, the people who run these companies also know that climate is changing. They know that something will be expected of them at some point, and that a price on carbon is the most likely way of creating an incentive for both the private sector and others to act. And the unpredictability of policy is making it difficult for them to make long-term decisions.
That's
right. Yes.
And so they much rather see a gradually implemented carbon tax, for example, that is based on science and that is allowing them to gradually adjust their processes, rather than something that is implemented in an ad hoc basis and might change again 2 years later.
Just chipping in very quickly
Yeah.
here, I think that exactly this is that I hope that Paris can provide that signal with its framework to business as a more stable, unpredictable in terms of an agreement. That's my best hope for. And backed up by national legislation, of course.
Well, I think there's also, I mean, this might be something we can talk about more. There beyond the national political regime, there's a lot happening on the city level.
Absolutely.
And I think that tied with the possibility of the private sector to be a little bit more nimble than international nation states are, offers also an additional kind of portal into making change happen, boots on the ground change happen.
There is a study called the New Climate Economy, and that produced a report called Better Growth, Better Economy, Better Growth, Better Climate. And I have a question to all of you, actually. What do you see as an incentive for cities to be more energy efficient, to invest in infrastructure that's actually assisting to curb climate change? So, Karin, you want to start?
First.
Okay. Well, cities, is it half? When will half of the world's citizens live in cities?
More than half already.
Yeah, more than half. So it's an enormous important site, and I think what's happening now, it's interesting because I've been going to the negotiations like many of you since 2007, and sometimes when I get depressed, I go to the International Council of Cities, because there is where actually climate action is happening in, I think, 900 of cities in the US. From below comes a lot of much more ambitious targets. So I think it's already rolling a lot, and by addressing climate change in cities, you can address a range of other issues. There are so many co-benefits with a more carbon-free energy system, air pollution, more attractive for tourism. So there are many co-benefits in addressing climate. It's actually a win-win strategy. I don't know if you...
No, that's exactly the case, and I think that's particularly for cities in China and other areas where, I mean, many cities in the United States learned in the 1970s that air pollution was just not a good deal. And Chinese cities are having that realization now as well. So the co-benefit, of course, is if you close the coal-fired power plant and replace it with a renewable source, all of a sudden you have much less air pollution, you have fewer people in the hospital for respiratory disease, you have fewer people dying prematurely because of respiratory issues. So the list of co-benefits is actually quite long. And economically, and this is kind of the fun thing that's coming out from this report and from others, from the World Bank, from KPMG, from a lot of places, that if you actually tally up those co-benefits, the economic costs go from being a big cost to either a break even or you're actually saving money.
Yeah, the interesting thing is, I mean, like the private sector, cities are not doing this out of ideology.
No.
They're doing it because it makes sense. And this actually refers exactly to that last sentence here, that adaptation and mitigation can be integrated with other societal objectives. I mean, you mentioned air pollution as a very important one. This is going to be the key driver for climate policy at the moment in China is not the international policy process. It's because they realize that the current energy system is killing them. It's because, why are cities like Stockholm as well are putting so much effort into what might be interpreted as climate policy, like investing in public transport and so on. It's because also congestion of traffic is an enormous cost to the economy. It's because, as you say, air pollution is an enormous cost. It's because clean air, clean water, clean soils actually make sense. It makes it an attractive place to live here. It makes it an attractive place to invest here. So I think these co-benefits, or however you'd like to frame it, integrating climate policy with other societal objectives makes good sense. And that's sometimes what, I hope that Paris, or the outcome of Paris, recognizes that, because increasingly I have the feeling that there is a climate policy arena trying to come up with something that will lead to a 2-degree world or better. And then there's the rest of the world that has many other priorities. The two need to be merged. The two need to be integrated, because climate policy cannot be effective, cannot be successful if it ignores other priorities. Those other priorities will not be achieved. Development priorities, health priorities, and so on will not be achieved if they ignore climate change.
And Richard, that's kind of one of the fun things that I've been watching from the private sector development as well, is that many of the main actors in the private sector are already used to dealing with connected issues. So they're looking at nexus issues like the connections between water, food, energy, development, rather than looking at one issue at a time. And I think that's where perhaps many in the political regime might want to take a look at what's happening there and perhaps learn a little bit, because the connected issues are the natural way to approach the problem, not separately, but as a tightly connected system.
But I have a policy question for you then, because I'm thinking, the finance sector, you have a finance department at the ministry, you have the environmental department, and so on and so forth. You've been studying quite a lot about this policy arena. It would be very interesting to hear your point of view on that.
I'm taking up that question and just following this extremely important because it's linked to integrating policy area. Some argue, and I would say we have used the wrong metaphor. We compare climate change with decades of diplomacy where, for example, ozone, regulating the stratospheric ozone layer is seen as the best model. That's like the peak. But to regulate, to actually decrease ozone depleting substances is completely different than the climate change challenge that cut across energy, economy, and it's a much more challenging. So we are using, in a way, decades of environmental diplomacy negotiating a framework convention, then a protocol on an issue. Some would argue, climate change is not only an environmental problem, it needs to be successful in policy outcomes, it is address synergies. And this is also then the challenge of the process of multilateral environmental negotiations, where environmental ministers are sent to negotiate and to these meetings, and that's a sign sometimes when the ministers are there that it's not as important. When the finance ministers come, then things can be rolling. So, and especially for climate change, but I think we have had the model of biodiversity and ozone and forestry, which are very challenging issues, but in a way, climate change is, as we as political scientists say, it's the ultimate collective action problem. How to coordinate 196 states and create a rational outcome. So it's a challenge unforeseen, and here we cannot think sectorally. We need to get Minister from Finance, Trade, development, environment engage in this collective endeavor.
And what would you see is the most important, if you would mention 3 important, the way forward for the policy arena in order to get the decisions together and mitigate climate change?
3.
3.
Oh, do you mean for Paris? Are you talking about? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, as Richard is talking about, I mean, there are many issue areas here. What mitigation and adaptation to get strong action on commitments in these on mitigation commitments. They are completely insufficient to meet the 2-degree goal. That is to get, and I guess we will discuss the developing countries also, because if the rich industrialized countries don't deliver here, I mean, the growing distrust and calls, I would say the second issue is equity and fairness, to get a fair and equitable deal, because only that will be meaningful. But then we have, and I know Richard can talk about that, finance and funding, extremely important. I'm not an expert here, but that issue, I mean, climate finance, and also, as Kevin talked about, an agreement that gives the signal to industry and the other actors and stability. Well, I have a longer list of 3.
Okay, so Richard, climate finance, can you give us an update?
Yeah, I think climate finance, there's a lot of focus on how much is this going to cost the Swedish taxpayer or the American taxpayer, and money is needed in developing countries in order to make them change to cleaner technology and avoid the mistakes that we have made. Climate finance is different from development aid. It's not something that is out of charity, out of goodwill, because those poor developing countries, they don't have the means to do it themselves. It's an international obligation. We have agreed collectively in 1992 that the rich would help the poor in meeting climate objectives, both adaptation and mitigation. The question then is where does that money come from? How is it transferred to developing countries, and what are they going to do with it? What is it used for? There's a lot of discussion not only about how much money would be needed, but also about, well, how do we make sure that this money doesn't disappear in some kind of black hole? The accountability question. We as taxpayers expect that money that is transferred from the north to the south is used for those activities that also benefit us, in terms of reducing emissions in China, for example, because it's cheaper there than in Europe, or in avoiding food crisis in developing countries through adaptation, which would also help us. So there was a strong emphasis on what is called accountability and transparency, making sure that money is used that we as taxpayers can basically control how that money is being spent. One would argue that that's a good thing. Intuitively, of course, it makes sense. We all know that corruption is real, and we want to make sure that there is no corruption with climate finance. At the same time, by putting in all these checks and balances, in the jargon it's called MRV, measuring, reporting, and verifying climate action and climate finance. By putting in all these checks and balances, we're expecting developing countries to spend pretty much all their time writing reports on how much progress is being made on each individual project that is financed from climate finance at the expense of real action or real effectiveness. So that's an interesting dilemma, that on the one hand, yes, we want the climate finance system to be transparent and accountable, but at the same time, we want it to be effective. And one of the questions that we as researchers, but also the negotiators, are grappling with is how can we ensure effectiveness without putting an enormous burden on developing country civil servants and others to meet our transparency and accountability expectations.
Okay, Kevin.
Well, I wanted to jump in there because I think it nicely illustrates a trap that Karin mentioned earlier about being siloed and slicing things up into sectors. Is that, Richard, you said quite correctly that development and aid financing is different from climate financing. I think we should probably ask ourselves the question, need it be? because the ultimate goal would be to enable people in developing countries to have well-being at a level that is dignified, and for all of our neighbors on the planet to have a level of well-being that is dignified. And
But
so if that's the goal,
why should we care about that?
well, yeah, I mean, if
Some people say that.
there's, well, that's going to change the conversation a lot. So, but let's assume that that's a goal that we all share, just for the sake of not going into that conversation. The question then becomes, how do you best achieve that goal with the means that you have available to you? And then it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to keep separating development and aid financing from climate financing or agricultural financing, but to try to solve that particular conundrum in a connected way.
Yeah.
And I think interesting possibilities are public-private partnerships, because these big companies, these multinational companies, have that same goal as well. Not only do they want to be operating in these countries, sell their product in these countries, but the stability of these areas is something that they care deeply about.
That is happening, though. I think it's interesting to see that a development agency like CEDA, but others as well, the UK, the Dutch, the Germans, they're all realizing that there is a tight connection between climate finance and development assistance. The politics behind it are very different. But of course, if you reduce vulnerability through development, if you give people access to water, if you increase democratic processes, health, sanitation, education, and so on, they're the typical development priorities. If you're successful with that, then people automatically become better able to cope with climate change. They become less vulnerable. So there is a connection, and there's a lot of jargon around it as well. It's about mainstreaming climate risks into development assistance. What's interesting, though, it also has a political dimension. It goes back to the issue of accountability. Developed countries report the amount of money that they spend on development assistance to the OECD. And there is an international target of spending 0.7% of gross national income on development assistance. And not many countries actually meet that target. Sweden is one of them. Then there's no target on climate finance, but like I said, there is an international obligation, there is an agreement that this is a global collective problem, and that there is a responsibility that the North supports the South in climate finance as well. What happens is that in reports on how much money countries spend on climate finance, we see the same money appearing. So there is a double counting going on. Money that is reported to the OECD as development assistance is then also reported to the UNFCCC as climate finance, where you can only spend the money once, right? Maybe you can argue that some of these activities that are supported with that money are both development and climate, create climate benefits as well as development benefits. But it also creates an impression that more money is being generated than is actually the case. And that then leads to distrust, where developing countries are pointing at the rich countries and saying, well, you're promising this and that, but you're actually not delivering. You're just some kind of bookkeeping and accounting tricks that help you to show that you're meeting the targets, but you're actually not.
That's very interesting. And I think when it comes to taxpayers' money, you all know that you care about your own wallet and how much money you have on your account. And I think there is a very, very strong trend, at least, that this is getting more and more important in the policy arena. And these discussions are, as I see it, working with communication, much more common nowadays than they used to be when it comes to climate change. So what do you think the business should do, Kevin? If you look at a big company, like we can take some examples, some of the big oil companies, what would you like to see happen in the future when it comes to responsibility and actions?
Well, it's kind of interesting. One of the recurring discussions I have with working with various people at Shell, for instance, there seems to be, this is just an outside observer, I don't work for Shell, but I go and talk to people who do on occasion, and there seems to be a couple of different viewpoints on what the Shell DNA is, and this is just an example of a large oil company, for instance. One would be that Shell is a fuels company, Not an energy company, not an oil company, but a fuels company. They know how to look for fuel, they know how to drill for it, they know how to pipe it out of the ground, and transport it and refine it. That's their identity, their DNA. There are other people apparently who think, well, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, we can't be just a fuels company. That's not a possibility. So that means that we have to prepare to be something else. Maybe we're an energy company, maybe we're something other than just a fuels company. And what keeps me somewhat optimistic about that process is that watching that happen, I don't know where they are at this point. It seems like they're behaving as if they're a fuels company more than an energy company at this, right at the moment. But nonetheless, it seems like the realization is there. They're one of the companies that does scenarios work, kind of the gold standard really in the private sector for their scenarios work. And they do routinely look 50 to 100 years out into the future. And in doing that process, it does make you think, if you're running the boat now, if you're the captain of the boat, okay, so I don't want the boat to crash into a reef, or I don't want it to, sink or whatever. What do I do now? How do I change the behavior? Interestingly, another company that I've been working with, this Norske Veritas, or DNVGL, came out with one of the best reports on sustainability that I've ever seen recently. And what they've done is they've outlined what the situation is right now: climate change, the loss of biological diversity on the planet, fresh water, all sorts of different things. But said, okay, this is what we've got at the moment. This isn't a sustainable future for us or anybody else. What are the barriers to achieving a more sustainable future, and what are some of the solutions to getting past the barriers? And they've identified cognitive and behavioral barriers, technological barriers, governance barriers, business barriers, and come up with ideas for how to get past many of these. And I think it's that kind of integrated planning, really, that I'm quite optimistic about, and I'm seeing more and more of, particularly in the private sector. And I'm hoping that that's going to happen rapidly enough, and that will be contagious, if you will, for the negotiators in Lima and Paris, and the negotiators that are working on fisheries agreements internationally and biodiversity agreements internationally, that thought process will actually be contagious and maybe infect them in a positive way.
So do you think it's about having a vision for the future and changing track of that vision to become something else than you had?
Well, you always have to have a vision. I mean, if you're operating with, only short-term stimulus, then you're lost. We're lost. So I think the vision is quite important. But it's also, it's not, you have to be able to see that I'm making progress towards that vision.
Let's not kid ourselves. I mean, what companies care about is their bottom line, and if they don't care about that, their shareholders will lose them out, right? I mean, what needs to happen is that the bottom line is attractive when taking care of climate change and taking climate action. That could be done in several ways. It could be because demand and supply for certain goods or services changes by behavioral change. If we somehow manage that within society, it is no longer fashionable to use goods or services that are made with much fossil fuel, then obviously that supply will change. If there is a price on carbon, if it becomes more expensive to use fossil fuels, I mean, at the moment there is no reason. I mean, Shell and also other companies, of course, they are looking at the future, but at the moment they also realize it is much cheaper for them to run their operations with fossil fuel that is often subsidized as opposed to taxed, than to divert to renewable energy. The moment renewable energy is attractive to them financially as well as politically, then they will make that change. So I think that's also where it's not necessarily a public-private partnership, but it is an area where public action, policy, politics, and private decision-making goes hand in hand. You need to provide financial, policy, and other incentives to make companies as well as individuals change their mind. Now, in the end, it's all about free choice. We don't want to live in a country where people can't choose to eat meat or whatever. But where at the same time people are informed about the consequences of their actions, and people have the option and perhaps are encouraged to change their behavior. And the same goes for companies. And I mean, I hear you talk about a vision. I think that's very important. I think some of the cleverest minds are within these companies. They know very well what is needed. But at the same time, they're also responsible to their shareholders, and they can't sell a policy that goes beyond what is good for the sustainability of the company if it's not sustainable for
I don't want to disagree with you, but I want to nuance that statement with just a couple of examples. And one, I agree with you that there isn't a company on the planet yet that is truly sustainable, nor are any of us, really. Partially driven by the fact that you need to have a profit at the end of the year by year, if you want your company to survive. But let me give just two counterexamples. One comes from Unilever, and it was some years ago when the CEO of Unilever, Paul Polman, said, look, Unilever's not going to do quarterly reports anymore, because quarterly reports give us information that tends to want to show us that we maximize short-term economic gains at the expense of long-term sustainability and survivability. So we're not going to do quarterly reports. He was beaten up by his board. He was beaten up by all the people, the shareholders that showed up.
That's showing leadership.
Yes.
And he said, sorry, this is what we're going to do. And what last year he could point to the bottom line and say, here's the bottom line. We're more profitable now than we ever have been in our history, and we don't do quarterly reports. Now, that might be confusing correlation with causality, but those two events happened in that sequence. The other was a very interesting statement by the CEO of DNVGL this last summer, who said, look, nobody started a company just because they wanted to make money. At least he didn't know anybody that started a company just because they wanted to make money. Somebody starts a company because they feel that new company can fulfill a need. Whether that need be a good need or a bad need, that's a different question. But you don't start up a big company just to become a profit-making organization. Maybe if you're in the financial sector, you do. I don't know.
I think that's a very important question. And we have a question from the floor over there.
Wait, the box. What's that? Oh, it's the microphone.
Good catch.
I want to ask this question, if climate change is possible under this system, what is now adapted in the most of the world is capitalism, where profit, money, and so consumption, and this is like most important. So if this goes along with climate change, where we should more reduce our consumption and live more sustainable, and so this is my question: how we could change, and if this could be a bottom-up thing, or if it's like a top-down solution, or maybe both.
I think we probably all have an answer to that. Yes.
You get a very half a minute each.
Okay.
Wow.
That's cool. You touch upon the largest question, and that is liberal capitalism, liberal democracy compatible with environmental protection? That's an enormous, interesting issue, a lot of research on it. But to give a short answer, this is yes, I think we can create a capitalism 0.20. But we have talked here, we need to have a portfolio of, on all accounts. We need strong regulation. We need self-regulation from below. We will need normative shifts. For example, now young people are not. It's not so attractive to the car industry is suffering from a crisis. Suddenly, it's not so attractive to drive cars. So we need all the spectrum from carrot sticks policies, top down, bottom up, to actually manage this challenge.
No, boy, that is one of the really big questions. And I mean, the simple answer is that infinite growth based on finite resources is mathematically impossible. Okay, it just doesn't work. That equation, there's no equal sign. The interesting thing, I think, the one way of potentially reframing it is what is it that we want to grow? And thus far, the capitalist idea has been, well, we want the economy to grow, or we want my personal wealth to grow. What if I wanted my well-being to grow instead? That might allow for different kinds of optimization techniques.
Yeah. Two issues there. I think I fully agree with you that, yes, clearly the current capitalist system, or the way the capitalist system has been used, is obviously a large reason why we are in this predicament. What would be easier to implement? Measures to reduce climate change, or to turn over the capitalist system into something else, and we don't quite know what the outcome is? I would like to think that it is still easier to tackle climate change. I'm not too worried that we are stuck with the capitalist system. It's a question of form and substance. The capitalist system is the form. I think it's the substance with that, what we do with that form, how we use the capitalist system that needs to change. I'm absolutely convinced that we can actually use the capitalist system to change behavior of companies, of individuals, of countries, by, for example, putting a tax on carbon. It's a very capitalist, if you like, measure. It's a policy that can only be introduced within a system that is, if you like, capitalist. You cap and trade even more so, trading emissions that you have a surplus of. So by and large, I think we need to not worry too much about capitalism per se, but how we use capitalism and see whether that's compatible with a future climate.
Thank you. I just want to add one thing, and that is that in fossil fuels, it's subsidized 6 times more than renewables. In the report, New Climate Economy, you can read that. And I would like to thank the panel very much for participating. Karin Bäckstrand, Kevin Noone, Richard Klein. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
And
Thank you for coming.
thanks for listening.
It's about time. It is about time. It's about time now. It's about time. It's about time now. It's about time now. It's about time. It's about time now. Every second is a glance. Every minute is a chance. Every hour got some power. Every day is a time to play. Stop. Rewind. We're on fast forward. It's about time now. It's about time. It's about time now. It's about time now. It's about time. It's about time to move or get moved. So said an old dance teacher to me. Move or get moved. He already passed on to the next round. I don't want to do that yet. I feel there are still things for us to find. We are still here. Here. That sound of the flies and the trees and the birds. How they whisper to us. You came here to be a humankind, not a human evil. You came here to be a humankind, not a human evil. Don't kill us with your lifestyle. That isn't stylish. Don't kill us with your lifestyle. Style. My God. Ooh. I need rest a while. My God. There's too much pollution in my mind. Humanity. We need a vacuum cleaner. It's getting really dusty on this planet. The animals are running away. They say we need to go another way. Of course I can grow up. I can get a nice salary. But I can't leave my roots. And I don't want to kill them. I want to learn how to eat them. Humanity! Hey, humanity. Humanity? Why do we renovate our kitchens and not the big kitchen, the ecosystem? Why do we renovate our kitchens and not the big kitchen, the ecosystem? Humanity! We need some economical support and advising here. We need some investment. We need to raise the rate in the heart. The heart rate is going low in some places. We need to pump in some fresh blood and stop the next flood and ecological disaster. We need connection here. We need connection. From the stomach, through the heart, to the brain. Then we can release ourselves of our big common pain. Connection through the heart and the brain. Then we can release ourselves of our big common pain. Get the resources right, inside out. Get the resources right, on the inside and out. But do I dare? Bear. Do I dare to meet? Do I bare feet? Every day I may choose to wear or not wear shoes. And every day I wear shoes, I may choose what my soul will look like. Where to go and how to flow through life. Come on. Just one more steak. Come on, just one more car. Come on, just one more plane ticket. Just one more bureaucratic measure that prevents this society from equating itself with Earth. This is justice time. This is justice time. This is justice time. It is just this time on Earth that we can change the fate of generations. Because already in August, humanity has used the resources for a year. The rest we borrow from our kids. Don't tell them. They might panic or feel rightful fear. This is justice time. This is justice time to give a present to our grandkids. So that they may be grand and present. And maybe we can get a second chance. Or maybe a minute chance. An hour chance. A day chance, or maybe even a lifetime chance. Because everyone who dares to share will also be given care. It's about time now. It's about time. It's about time now. It's about time now. It's about time. It's about time to move.